Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Mandy. This film was directed by Costa Mentos. Even that name sounds made up. He is an Italian/Canadian writer-director, and this is his second feature-length film. His first film was Beyond the Black Rainbow, which came out in 2010, I believe. I did see that movie, but I don't feel qualified at all to review it because I saw it, I think, like in college or something, and we'll just say I wasn't sober. Panos's films are, it's important to watch them when you're sort of under the influence. It's the ideal way to experience it, I believe. I think it's like one of those movies that you want to watch when it comes on at 4 o'clock in the morning on Adult Swim. You are on your third hour of tripping LSD. Just the style of his two films that he's made thus far, it seems like the ideal setting, you know, especially when you have the correct filters. Mandy is a highly stylized sort of pastiche film. It is a genre piece. It is drawing inspiration from a lot of late 1970s films to early 1980s films, especially kind of psychedelic cult movies. And yeah, I mean, this movie is just kind of drenched in lysergic bliss. It's heavy metal, it's bloody, it's gory, and it stars Nicolas Cage. I feel like I don't need to sell this much harder. I feel like Costa Mentos really knows his audience more than a lot of directors do, and that is exactly who he's pandering to. He's pandering to the kind of person, especially like the hipsters who buy albums by Tangerine Dream and Pink Floyd on vinyl. But that makes a big difference, I think, when you know who your audience is. And for me, it's in the details. It's in the aesthetic details. And he's a big cinema fan. He's drawing heavily from some great directors of the periods that I mentioned. You know, a lot of cult sci-fi horror movies a la Cronenberg or De Palma, and even directors like Dario Argento. I thought of Suspiria quite a bit. At its core, though, it's a simple, bloody revenge tale, and it takes place deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest in 1983. It's about a guy named Red Miller, played by Nicolas Cage, and his wife named Mandy, and they live a very bohemian, very quiet existence off the grid, very secluded from the rest of society. And they're the kind of people that, you know, they're very spacey. They like to talk about their favorite planets as they drift to sleep at night. But one day there is a cult leader, the antagonist of the film, named Jeremiah Sands, and his character is inspired a lot by Charles Manson. That's quite clear. But he sees Mandy walking in the woods and he is immediately taken with her. And so he orders a lot of his followers to go in and capture her. I'll just say that a lot of bad things happen, and it leads Red to becoming this Neanderthal-like beast that is ready to slay anyone in his path in order to get his revenge against Jeremiah. This movie, as I said before, it's very much drenched in lysergic bliss. There's that feeling all the way throughout the movie, and I think that it's very much in the core themes of the story as well, because even in the very opening part of the movie, you see Red and he's just driving on the road out in the woods, and you hear Reagan in the car radio. And of course, it wouldn't be a 1980s nostalgic type movie without Reagan as the oppressive symbol. While he's talking about social, political issues, Red just turns off the radio, and it's as if to say, you know, we're gonna take you away from all the social expectation that you're used to, and we are going to disorient you right from the very beginning. And it's submerging you into what feels like this very kind of almost folkloric fairy tale that is combined with this like really horrific sort of phantasmagoria. It's as if the civilized world is just melting away as the LSD is kicking in. And speaking of that, this movie does a really, really good job of setting the atmosphere for what it's like for tripping. I've got to say, this is one of the better movies I've seen in a while, where I feel like they really understood it. They really captured it as well as they possibly could. A lot of voice distortion, slow motion. The color palette is very extreme. A lot of very bright reds and blues. You've got lens flares, you have a synth-based score, and a sort of hazy otherworldliness. This movie is very zeitgeisty, it's very kitsch, but it does have a sense of humor about all of that. I feel like it's very self-aware. It recognizes the psychedelic cliches and kind of the pop culture aspects of that nostalgia very well. And it is a movie that is very dark and very strange, but it's also really funny. A lot of the themes of the movie have to do with Obviously, cultism is a big one, and the masculinity complex, another big one, and kind of the shunning of social and political barriers. But the key part of all that is how all of those ideas can be distorted and bended through that psychedelic filter, for better or worse. For instance, when Mandy is captured, they do sort of drug her, and she's under the influence of LSD, presumably. Jeremiah, for instance, I'm assuming that he is also on acid, but when he is trying to impress Mandy, she starts to ridicule him. Now, if they were sober, you're thinking that maybe it probably wasn't that bad, but under the influence, your feelings and everything is magnified to such a degree, and he thinks that she is just being absolutely awful to him. And as a result, as I mentioned, bad things start to happen. He does all of these horrible things to both Mandy and Red, just as a way to maintain that control, to maintain that feeling of being a leader, being worshipped. And even Red, the character, he's meant to be the hero, but he's very different in the first half of the film compared to the second half. And in the first half, he seems to be very kind of quiet and peaceful man. But then he morphs into this really vengeful madman who is all of a sudden so animalistic and very violent. But I think that that's kind of cool because, you think you know somebody, but when their world gets turned around completely and they lose something, or they go through something seriously traumatic and they want revenge, it completely changes you. You can go from somebody who is very mild-mannered to somebody who is completely crazy violent. And it's often the most unsuspecting person that's the one that does all of that lashing out. And I think that Nicolas Cage is the perfect person to be playing a role like this. He can propel us into this world that Costa Mentos has created, because whether you love Cage or you hate Cage, you have to respect his commitment to all of his projects. I gotta say, I watched an interview with Cage fairly recently, and he really impressed me. I felt like he has a passion for acting that I just wasn't aware of. And he's got a great knowledge of the cinema. He's not interested in being a realist. He's not interested in being a very kind of organic actor. He likes to be very over the top. He's into a lot of the silent movie dramas and a lot of the acting from that period. He likes Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. And his style is just more like kabuki theater. It feels like something you'd see from James Cagney, who I loved as an actor, just because he's so unpredictable. You never knew what he was going to do. And I feel the same way about Nicolas Cage. Okay, I know Nicolas Cage is maybe way more over the top, but they remind me of each other in certain ways. And yeah, you can't take your eyes off of him. I mean, he's scene chewing, but it's more like he's scene devouring. And when you're watching a movie that is essentially laced with LSD in so many ways, it is very unpredictable and unhinged, and you need an actor that can kind of match that. In this performance, he's doing things that I haven't seen him do maybe to this extent. At times, he's obviously very funny. He's hilarious when he's overdoing kind of the extremes. But there are moments in the movie where he is genuinely terrifying. His physicality is just really imposing and frightening, especially in the second half. And I think he's very aware of how drugs are playing such a big part of how it's twisting the reality of this story, both literally and metaphorically. There's a moment at the end of the film, and spoiler alert, but he's driving away from all of the carnage, and he has this moment where it's meant to be sort of dreamlike, and he's just driving, and he turns and looks at the passenger seat, and he sees his wife, and they're both kind of looking at each other. And at first he seems really bewildered from all he's gone through, and then he looks at her, and there's this sort of enlightenment, a sense of hope, as well as devastation because of the loss. And then it cuts back to him, and he has this sort of strange, like Joker-esque grin on his face. It's as if to say, like, what are all of these emotions that are associated with loss? As they grow more extreme, they start to blend together. And in many ways, when life starts to get extreme and really dark and intense, yeah, things get really jumbled, and all of a sudden it's almost like it's a joke. You're looking at life as a joke, and sometimes it can be weirdly funny. And yeah, I think he's at that point, like in a trip. At a certain point, you get exhausted and so delirious that all of these demons that have manifested themselves into this sort of imagery around you, you start to taunt it. You start to laugh at it, you know, out of your deliriousness. And there's something powerful about that, recognizing your pain, but then being able to rise above it and mock it, see it as a joke. Drugs, of course, play a huge part in this film, both metaphorically and literally, and just the way that they twist your reality, and so that violence can be amped up to such an extreme degree while you're on them, but then again, so can joy, and so can fear and laughter. And they all blend into a sort of sludge that's pretty discernible and very abstract. But at times it can be too much. I think there's a fine line it's a very small one between that personal enlightenment that you can achieve on said substances compared to a lot of the insanity and madness. But I like that this movie shows you both sides, how these sorts of substances can be used for good and for bad. Because for sure, I mean, there's a negative to them. Like in the case of Jeremiah, or even in real life, if you want to look at somebody like Charles Manson, you know, that sort of thing, twisting your reality, it leads to this very strange cultism and brainwashing, which is very characteristic of humans, wanting to belong to a group, wanting to fit in and follow one person. So these things have been used against us to control us. And I keep thinking about, you know, like the CIA, for instance, and how they also wanted to use these substances for their own benefits against the people at a certain point. If I do have to have a few complaints about the movie, I would say that as much as I do enjoy it, I was really entertained by it, I do think that it does get a little bit wrapped up in its own aesthetic. Yes, it is obviously a genre piece, but I do think that it's so easy, especially nowadays, to take that vehicle, like a genre piece, and then kind of fetishize that pop culture. We do that all the time in our entertainment, and there's some really well done stuff out there that is very nostalgic and very detailed. The aesthetic is just spot on, and yet sometimes I feel like it's not saying that much. And I wish that this film took a lot of those ideas that I was discussing and really kind of propelled them into darker territories, because I think it could have been truly meaningful if they really explored those questions. I wanted to see how it could twist and how it could distort my perceptions even more. When you're using psychedelics as your way of primarily exploring the themes in your film, I mean, you have a playground in front of you, and you can open it up in all sorts of directions. And it's very ambitious, and it's, to me, I think, a tough thing to pull off. Even though I do have those complaints about it, at the same time, I think it knows exactly what kind of movie it is, and I think it knows exactly what it wants to be. I think the director here is making a passion project, and you know, that's cool. And exploring human tendency through a revenge fantasy is just a lot of fun. It's one of those movies where you know if you get the right audience, they're just gonna go crazy for it. And that's kind of the sense that I got. So yeah, I mean, I think that if you're a real cinema lover and you like those kinds of movies, especially psychedelic cult movies, you're gonna get a real kick out of this. And that's my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.